Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you. My name is Yavor Tarinski. I was born and raised in Bulgaria, but for the last 10 years I live in Athens. Throughout these years I have been politically active in both of these countries, as well as in transnational organizations that are interested in the production of grassroots knowledge. And some of them are the Transnational Institute of Social Ecology and the Bibliographers Network Agora International, dedicated to the spreading of the work and legacy of Cornelius Castoriadis. So I have always tried to combine political activism and militancy together with theoretical works. So I have published around 7 books, and some of them have been translated into Bulgarian and Spanish. And they are mostly focused on the issues of autonomy, direct democracy, social ecology, and in relation to the works of Bookchin, of Castoriadis, of Karo Poulani, Hannah Arendt, and other thinkers. So in the text of the invitation for today, there are several names listed there. Castoriadis, Bookchin, as well as social movements such as the Zapatistas and the Kurdish movement in Rojava, as well as other social movements. And I was thinking, what is the link between all these names? And the one thing that is there to take my eyes out, like we say, in the place where I'm from, it's the concept of democracy. And this is, it will be a key element in what I'm going to say to you today. Democracy, today when we hear about all kinds of democracies. In almost every country around the world claims to be a representative democracy, which means that few people are getting elected and they rule for several years, and we cannot do nothing else but to vote them into power every few years. Then we hear that there is a deliberative referendum democracy, like in Switzerland, that people once in a while get also to vote in referendums. We hear about direct democracy in a stateless form, like the Zapatistas and the Kurds. We hear even about democratic monarchy, let's say, in some countries where the institution of monarchism still exists together with supposedly democratic parliaments. So if one is checking all this list of types of democracy, it is difficult not to emerge in him this question. If all these models are supposedly democratic, all of them, what does democracy mean? It is meaningless. If a monarchy can be democratic and a classless and stateless society it can also be democratic, they're supposedly coexisting in a system that has a shared root. It has something in common. And this is obviously not the case. All these systems that I mentioned before, and many others that one can find, we will see that there is very little in common between all them. So what is the case then? If you go back to antiquity, to the ancient Athenians, yes, their society was very problematic. It was plagued by patriarchy, it was plagued by sexism, it was plagued by slavery. But when they spoke about democracy, they meant something very concrete. Democracy was the opposite of elections. It meant public assemblies and sortition. And this concept continued through the years. Democracy was something that was more close to anarchism than anything else. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his magnum opus, The Social Contract, when he speaks about democracy, he speaks of an utopian vision of society self-managing itself. Thomas Paine, another thinker of this period, the man of revolution. As well, when he speaks of democracy, he says in its pure form, it means society managing itself without intermediates. So until 18th century, there was a unanimous agreement that democracy means a society, a demos, who holds the power. But we can argue that with Alexis de Tocqueville, things become to change. He writes his famous Democracy in America, where what he's doing is he's describing how in the United States people were doing elections. He's becoming a radical reframing of the term. Later on, we have Lenin as well, who in one of his texts claims that even in proletarian democracy, we cannot imagine it without representative parliaments. So he continues down the same path, arguing that democracy means parliaments, means elections. There is a radical deviation on 180 degrees of the initial understanding of the concept. So democracy is used by demagogues, people who want to take power, to cover their lust for power and to present what they create as something that everyone is responsible for. So since you voted in the elections, what the system does, you are co-responsible for it, so you shouldn't complain too much. And of course, this has an additional component to it, an additional effect in the way people, for visionary thinking, let's say. Because even revolutionary thinking slides away from the political level, that is, from the level where decisions are being taken and power is being managed, into other levels that are below it, like the economic level, for example. Since the way to empower people politically is through elections, and we have governments, so freedom will come not by changing radically this central place, but to economic reforms. And from there, Castoriadis uses a term that he borrows also from Caro Polanyi, that of economism. That is thinking that becomes centered on the economic field alone. So thinkers like Castoriadis become very problematized with the rise of economism. More and more revolutionaries of his time and of our time as well tend to focus narrowly on the economic field, thinking how we can restructure the economy so that we can create a better society, leaving the question of power alone. And when Castoriadis encounters psychoanalysis, he becomes a psychoanalyst, he encounters some concepts and tools in psychoanalysis and the thought of Freud himself, which leads him in a path that deviates from Marxism, and he ultimately breaks with Marxism altogether. Because that I'll say now, we see it already from Freud, who says that for the Marxists, with the abolition of private property, we'll have better society, but we say that we see traces of aggression and of oppression before the emergence of private property. So the problem is elsewhere. And so Castoriadis as well starts to thinking that even if we abolish private property, this will not be an enough guarantee that we'll have a more just society. Have in mind that in his time, there are more and more news coming from Soviet Union that the system there is degrading into a total bureaucratic totalitarianism. So he becomes more and more convinced that just switching private property to national property, or just thinking about the economy, is not enough a precondition for a more just and more free society. The theoretical development of Murray Bookchin that takes place across the ocean in North America is similar. He is also initially a communist, Trotskyist, Marxist, but he also starts thinking, and further he analyzes the history of society, of human societies. The further he becomes convinced that this focusedness on the economy is a dead end. one thing, when he develops his concept of social ecology, he says that there were forms of oppression that predated capitalism. And two of the most ancient known to men and to humans forms of oppression are that of sexism, more particularly patriarchy, and gerontocracy. In some of the most ancient known to us societies, there were exactly these two forms of the man over the woman and of the older over the younger, of those who hold the knowledge and those who still do not hold so much knowledge. And both of these, nowadays, they still, he sees, and we can also see that these forms of oppression still exist, as, for example, gerontocracy today is not so much about age, but about who holds power. So there is the technocrat class, people who supposedly have the technological knowledge, and the rest of us. And so more and more we listen about this, since especially the financial crisis of the late 2000s, that we need more technocratic rule. We need nation states to be run as businesses, etc. Because there are people who know more. So this is very ancient forms of authority, and because of that, Bookchin said that we have, in a similar manner as Castoriadis, we have to start again focusing on the political issue, on the issue of authority and power, and the issue of decision making on a society-wide scale. So both of them start examining this concept of democracy. And what they examine is the emergence and the appearance on the historic stage through different periods, different historic periods of democracy, but as a passion from below, as something that common people do amidst revolts or through collective deliberation, and not as something that emerges from above. And more specifically, not as something that is limited to human rights or elections. When Castoriadis speaks of democracy, at one of his texts, he says that democracy is the system of the regime of self-limitation. When he speaks about self-limitation, he says that every society puts certain limits to its individual members. So that certain things are prohibited and certain things are allowed. And he's saying every heteronomous, that is hierarchical society, these limits are determined by those above, and those below have to follow. But he says that in a democratic society, we together collectively gather and set on a grassroots basis together the limits. So he said there will still be limits, but since we can decide and change them, it will give us real freedom. And like he said, when certain things are off limit, also certain things, by becoming allowed, it's created a space from which new anthropological type can emerge. So Bookchin develops similar understanding of democracy, and both of them agree that in such modes of self-management, there is the issue of power. Power is not abolished. Authority is abolished, but there is power. And this is where both of them, the one refuses to join and to take on himself the label of anarchist, while the other breaks up with anarchism. This is very important thing, and an important lesson, I think, for all of us to have in mind. We all know, or it's well known, that Bookchin was for a long period of time one of the leading anarchist thinkers of his time. But at some point he announced that I no longer consider myself anarchist. And what leads him to this? And why Castoriadis, in an interview with Greek anarchists in the 90s, when they asked him that what you speak sounds too much like anarchism, why do you don't call yourself anarchist? He says that anarchism is contemporary anarchists in their great majority are afraid to tackle the issue of power. And this is an important thing, in my opinion, that we should have in our mind when we organize, because ultimately all these texts written by such thinkers and all this have no importance if these texts are not transferred into political action in the streets, in the places, in the neighborhoods where we live, etc. I guess one of the more characteristic case that Bookchin refers when he decided to break up with anarchism was a trip that he did to a Sanettystraße conference in Spain, in Barcelona, and he say, I see a large graffiti on a wall saying that we do war on institutions. And this deeply problematized him, because later on he writes, what are the public assemblies that we envision in a future free society? There will be self-managed communes, okay? They'll be organized around such assemblies, decisions will be made. There will be confederations between these communes, but won't these assemblies have an institutional character? In the sense, if they take a decision, these decisions will have to be respected by the members of the community, even by those that will tend to disagree. And there will be such cases. And if they do not have an institutional character, would everyone be allowed to do as he please since the moment he disagrees with the decision? This leads him to think that if we adopt this attitude, that anarchism is simply a life without laws and institutions, he believes that this will mean that it cannot be implemented in practice because there is always a need of institutions. Castoriadis, as being more theoretical, more academic, and also being fluent in psychoanalysis, he goes even further by saying that even the human language is a formal institution. So it is deeply embedded in human nature. So we cannot create a society of Autonomie, which means society without laws. There will always be laws. The question is all of us to take lawmaking into our hands collectively. So they both, in a similar manner like other thinkers of their time, they start developing a vision, each one of them using different name. Castoriadis talking about a social and individual autonomy, Bookchin speaking about, on a more practical level, about libertarian municipalism. Both begin imagining how the institutional setting of a free society may look like, and what the path towards reaching such an institutional setting and such a society can have. And both of them leave behind them ideological dogmatism. So they see society for what it is, and they don't take they don't live in a dream world of how they would like things to be. So, for example, when referring to the Soviet Union, Castoriadis say USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 4 words, 4 lies. While many people during his time, even libertarian socialists and anarchists, were still unprepared to accept that there is a great problem there. Bookchin, in the same way, tackling the ecological movement, of which he became one of the big leading figures, also recognized that there are deep ecologists, people that try to unite ecology, to separate ecological issues from politics, and to try to mystify them into concepts of Mother Earth, inner human, and also eco-fascists, that they try to unite human blood with soil. So they both try to sustain their focus on the political issue, the question of power. We have, as it's written in the invitation text, we have such cases developing on social level. We have the luck to observe such cases developing in the world today, in the face of the Zapatistas, and also in the cantons in northeast Syria, or what is also known as Rojava. So these are not perfect societies, and this is something that we have to keep in mind. Society will never be perfect. It will always sustain an element of heterogeneity. There will always be problematic tendencies in societies. The question is how you limit the influence of these problematic elements. For example, the Zapatistas, one of the famous things in the beginning of their autonomy was the prohibition of alcohol. There was a vote all over the Zapatista caracols, and the majority decided that alcohol will be forbidden for feminist reasons, because men got drunk and were beating their women. So women wanted more empowerment. And alcohol was banned. Many Europeans have come back from their trips there and were complaining that it's really that we cannot drink, etc., etc. I come from the Balkans where we drink a lot. I myself like to drink. But I understand the need of a society to forbid it, and if I go there, I'll have to respect it. Because the obedience to collectively taken rules is something that keeps society together. Of course, this does not mean that all and always collectively make decisions will be just, but like Castoriadis says, it's always in our hands to struggle against injustice, even if it happened in a collective setting. And ultimately, he's saying no one can prevent society if it decides to commit a collective suicide. You can shout, you can fight it, but if society gets mad and decide to suicide collectively, it's difficult to stop it. So we have these societies that we see how things can be instituted differently, how power can be managed. Because have in mind, the Zapatistas, one of their motives to rebel was the new economic measures passed through the NAFTA agreement. But they did not just limit their rebellion and their demands on economic level, but instead they created a new polity, a new political system. They produced their own justice, and as probably some of you may know, one of the rules to be a Zapatista is not to accept money from the Mexican government, even in the form of welfare help, because they consider that becoming dependent on the state and losing part of your autonomy. So because time is advancing and I would like to have a dialogue and to hear opinion of what people here in this beautiful city think, I'll make some final remarks regarding to all this, that I think it's important for contemporary activism. Grassroots, radical, anti-authoritarian type of activism. So what I spoke about measures, laws, etc., passed by Zapatistas, by people in Kurdistan, these places may seem far, and some of the things that they agree upon, etc., may seem weird to us or problematic, etc. So I think that one of the most important things that we have to have in mind nowadays is to think in context. I have written in the past a text about this, that context is all. We have this tendency, especially in the Western world, but anymore everywhere is part of the Western world almost. We have this tendency to take as a starting point the place where we live, the things that we do, and we disregard the context of other places, of other people. So this is very important to consider other contexts, and this also means consulting the grassroots activists and movements that live in these other places. This is especially topical and needed in all the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist discourse. I will not get into detail about this, but for many, many years, there have been different people arguing what should happen in other countries, or supporting very problematic regimes in the name of supposed anti-colonialism, and saying that, okay, these societies are different, so let them live like that. But I will refer to two very important thinkers and revolutionaries. The one is both of them from the Caribbean. The one is C.L.R. James from Trinidad, and the other is Joseph Edwards. He was a plumber and author from Jamaica, a Rastafari thinker and council syndicalist. So both of them argued that the desire for common people taking control of their life is universal. All people around the world want this. Either they live in Iran, either they live in Russia, either they live in Austria or in the Balkans. There is no person who enjoys living in an authoritarian society, or who enjoys or who is inherently ultra-conservative. All people want this, and as they argue, in different parts of the world, in order for ultra-conservative and authoritarian regime to take hold means that there is a failed revolution. And this is nowhere probably better exemplified than Iran. In Greece, it happens that we have refugees from Iran, and some of them I call friends anymore, and they have told us about the existence of such movement that we don't really often hear, but we should search, because there are grassroots movements in most places in different names, but always we have to consider the context, and we always need to search to speak with such people, and not simply take as a starting point the place where we live. Another, I think, a very crucial issue is regarding all these single issue topics that are very often very important, but on their own they cannot lead us far. And what I mean by that, since the Russian invasion in Ukraine began, there happened last year a conference on Eastern European anarchism, and there were speakers from different countries. I was one of them, and there was very interesting a speech by a comrade from Finland who made very interesting remark. It was not something profound to say that no one ever said it before, but it rang a bell with me regarding my activism in different countries, because I have seen it many times. And he was saying that in contemporary activism, as he said in his place of living, is that many activists tend to focus on veganism, on identity politics, on maybe labor rights or whatever. And he said that all these things are very important, of course. But ultimately, if that many groups, however, tend to focus exclusively on this, and they abandon visionary thinking for the future of society, and he said that the danger of this is becoming essentially social democrats. We accept the basic skeletal structure of the society, and we try to make it work just smoother and more better. This is, for example, very typical of the United States, where we see even grand thinkers like Noam Chomsky and others often tend to adopt this understanding that the US is one of the most advanced political systems that we have, yes, problems, etc., but we could polish the rough edges around and it will work much better. And as Roots Zukri, there was one newspaper, I think from Germany, was saying on one of their cover pages that it's important to bigger the space that we have in the cage where we live. I totally agree with that. And all these issues are important. What I argue is that this should not take the central stage of our activism. It should always be visionary. If we look back in history, most struggles that were won and that brought major changes were ones that aimed for the sky so that they can achieve anything. This was a lesson that Rosa Luxemburg herself was teaching us.